Shavua Tov, Moshe Rabbeinu in the parasha of VaEra and Gam Shmot, and also throughout his career, uses a staff. Now, what is the purpose of this staff? Is it a prop? Why does Moshe need a prop? Can the miracles not be performed without a magic wand? Is it a magic wand? If it's anything, I think it may be more similar to the lightsaber that Luke Skywalker used in Star Wars. But I don't know if I'll mention that again. But if you hear what I say, maybe the comparison will appeal to you. So the question is why? Now, this staff was not any ordinary staff. It reminds me about the legend of Excalibur, the sword which was stuck in a rock, and the legend was that whoever could pick Excalibur up out of the rock would become the king, and of course along comes a guy named Arthur, and becomes King Arthur. Lehavdil, the Midrash says that the staff of Moshe was very similar. It was so heavy that nobody besides Moshe could lift it. Only Moshe was the one who could use it and lift it and carry it about. And the same thing about Aharon. So that's interesting. Why was that the case? Further, when Moshe is to take the staff back to Egypt, he's told by God, after he uses the staff, throws it on the ground, turns into a snake, and so forth and so on. And God says then, when you go back to Egypt, take the staff. You're going to do the miracles with the staff. Again, that question, why is the staff necessary for the miracles? But Moshe doesn't just take it in the trunk, in the suitcase on the donkey. He holds it in his hand and carries it with him the whole way. So that's a very significant detail as well. Moshe is inseparable from this staff. What is the purpose of this staff? So upon thinking about this, I realized that two distinct people will use a staff. One is a shepherd, of which Moshe was, and the other is a king, of which Moshe also was, in a sense. A shepherd uses the staff to guide the flocks that they should go in the right direction and keep them in control. And of course, a king uses a staff for a very different purpose, to force his nation to observe his laws. It's a weapon, in a sense, to hit and by force to get compliance with his commands and with his orders. So these two very different roles of a staff. One is to be a shepherd, a guide, a teacher, if you will. And Moshe Rabbeinu was certainly the guide and teacher of the Jewish people. And it's also to be a king who forces compliance. And Moshe also fulfills this role, when he goes to Egypt and he uses the staff to bring about the 10 plagues and thus to force Pharaoh to allow the Israelites to leave the country. So it's also used to hit and to bring about plagues. In Hebrew, it works nicely. A ro'eh is a shepherd and a rodeh is a ruler. So it even rhymes in Hebrew. Great. So there's another question that we want to understand about this staff, and that is there's a miracle that took place that in the story when Moses and Aaron are standing in front of Pharaoh and they throw their staffs. Aaron and the magicians throw their staves onto the ground, and Aaron's staff turns into a serpent, which then proceeds to consume the other staffs. Now, you would think after eating a big meal like that, Aaron's staff would be bigger and fatter, but it was not. It was the same size, according to the rabbis in the Midrash, that it was before. That's a nice miracle. It reminds us of the dream of Pharaoh with the 7 thin cows and the 7 fat cows. But why was that necessary in this instance? So I think that the question is really, who was the staff for? Was it for the Jewish people? Was it for controlling Egypt? Was it necessary to make these miracles? I think not. I think that the staff was for Moshe. It was for his benefit, and he needed it in order to be Moshe. If we recall in last week's Parsha Shemot, Moshe is a very reluctant leader. God has to work hard to convince him to go on the mission. Moshe keeps objecting. They're not going to listen to me. They want to know your name, and so forth and so on. I stutter, and so forth and so on. And finally, he says, send someone with me, and now God gets upset. So Moshe is a reluctant leader, and it could be that God is simply saying to Moshe, this staff is going to remind you of who you are, and it's going to give you the strength to carry out your mission. So you will carry this physical staff. It's lahavdil. It's like a uniform. When a person wears a uniform or dresses in a certain way, it affects their behavior. Moshe carrying the staff will turn him into these two roles. He will be, on the one hand, a shepherd, and he'll, on the other hand, be a king, a ruler over Egypt by bringing 10 plagues through the agency of raising his staff and demonstrating force on Pharaoh to force him to coerce him to release the Israelites. So therefore, he's got those two roles: the shepherd and the enforcer, if you will. That's a good word. And Moshe needs this. Moshe needs this. And this is an interesting thing which can help us explain something else, which I always was puzzled by. Twice in the period in the desert, Moshe is confronted with a lack of water, and he has to bring water to the Jewish people. The first time is happening shortly after they leave, and Moshe is instructed to hit the rock, and he strikes the rock, and the water comes out. The second time is many years later, right before the Israelites are to enter their promised land, a place called Me Meriva, and Moshe is instructed to speak to the rock, but before he's instructed to speak to the rock, he's told, take the staff with you. And the question is, why? He's not going to use it, he's going to talk to the rock. And Moshe himself may have gotten confused, and he hit the rock and was punished for it instead of talking to the rock. So if he's going to talk to the rock, why bring the staff with you? And perhaps we can explain that the difference between the Israelites when they first left Egypt and the Israelites on the eve of their entering the promised land was a very great difference. You see, a newly freed slave may be physically out of servitude, but not emotionally or mentally out of servitude. As they say, you can take the Jew out of Egypt, but it's harder to take Egypt out of the Jew. There's a verse, there's a verse in the Parsha that implies that God says, I will take them out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will save them from their servitude. And these seem to be redundant. Why under the burdens of Egypt and then repeat out from their servitude seems to be redundant. So the Hebrew word for the burdens of Egypt is sivlot, which could also mean savlanut, which means tolerance. They were tolerating their identity as slaves. So God is going to take them out and eventually cause them to cease feeling like slaves, cease tolerating a slave mentality. And that is a harder task. And that didn't happen right away. And the slave mentality is such that the slave understands the language of force. Basically, the slave does what he is forced to do. So therefore, when Moses has to bring water in the first few weeks after they've left Egypt, so he uses the staff as a king to hit, as a rodeh, as an enforcer, to hit the rock and to bring water out. But then, 40 years later, when they are about to enter the promised land, this is already a new generation. These people were not slaves. They were born in the wilderness. They were born into freedom. And so you can't use the same approach. Now, Moshe, you have to be a shepherd. And that's why you bring the staff, to remind you that you are now a shepherd. And a shepherd is one who leads by teaching, not by forcing. I remember I once went to a place called Neot Kedumim. And in Neot Kedumim, they did a wonderful little exercise with the group. There was a flock of sheep there. Yes, actually. And they gave one or two in our group the opportunity to try to get the sheep to go from here to there, from one spot, and go into the enclosed pasture. And it was very funny. People were trying. They would take the staff and go and walk in front of the sheep and call to them, here, sheepy, 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 whatever they would do. And the sheep would be going this way and that way, and it was just really, really funny. Until after one or two of them tried and failed. So then the guide said, now let me show you how to do it. And he goes behind the sheep. He makes a noise to get the sheep start moving. And when one of the sheep goes this way or that way, he goes and he taps on the ground next to the sheep to remind it, oh, no, you can't go that way. You got to turn back and go with the rest of the flock. And that is the way of the shepherd. The way of the shepherd is to guide, to teach, but not to hit. And that is what Moshe was being taught at Me Meriva. Bring the staff as a shepherd. You use the staff to knock on the ground here and there to guide them in the right way, but you do not need to hit them because this is a different generation. So that would be a nice explanation. And there is a commentary, the Katav Sofer, who says, why was it that Aaron's staff didn't get fatter? Because there are two types of miracles that can happen in the world. The greater miracle is the miracle which happens using the rules of nature, which very often is not even noticeable. The lesser miracle is when the laws of nature are suspended, and this would include the splitting of the sea and all of the big plagues that happened to Egypt. That's a lesser miracle? I would think that's a greater. It's much more impressive. The answer is yes, it's more impressive, but it is not sustainable. It is not long-lasting. That kind of miracle happens once and then it's gone. But the miracle that happens through nature, the hidden miracles which persist to this day, that lasts forever. And that was a hint, the fact that Aaron's staff was unnoticeable, the miracle he had just performed, a moment afterwards. If somebody had come late to Pharaoh's office that day, they would have missed the whole show. So that is to teach us that the superior miracle is one where you do not notice it, where it is part and parcel of the way of the world. And so therefore one could take from that also that Moses, as a shepherd, his job was to create a people that would enjoy these quiet, silent miracles that will guide them forever. He gives a little tap on the ground this side, a little tap on the ground on that side, and they go the straight way. They're preserved, they're protected, they are taught. And this is long lasting. When one forces someone else to accept one's point of view with violence, then that will not last. And unfortunately, we're seeing in the world too much violence. What we saw in America, the violence, people attempting to force their opinions through violence, is a terrible, terrible thing. And that will not succeed. Oh, you can intimidate for a certain amount of time, but eventually, as the conqueror's strength wanes, then the conquered will no longer identify with the conqueror. But if you make the change not through violence or force, but through education, through teaching, through inspiring, through guiding, well, that change will last. Just like the miracles that happen hidden through nature, but not by beating down on nature. So the staff of the shepherd is the staff that must be used henceforth. The staff of the Rodeh had its time and had its place, but the staff of the shepherd, it must be used henceforth, and it was there. The staffs were there. The staff was there because that helped Moshe know who he was and what role he was fulfilling at any given time, and that was part and parcel of it. It wasn't a magic wand. It was like a lightsaber. I'll mention it, where use the force, Luke, lahavdil. The staff simply enables Moshe to access his role of shepherd and guide and inspirational leader. Shavua Tov.